94 words, 9 minutes. One U.S. courtroom gleaming like justice on the surface, but reeking of something far older beneath it: arrogance, control, and the bitter stench of history. They brought Ibrahim Traoré, a president from a place they couldn't pronounce, into a legal trap dressed up like democracy. Cameras were rolling, headlines were drafted, even the verdict was practically rehearsed. He walked in alone. No lawyers, no flag, just a red folder in the kind of silence that makes power nervous. And when the judge, Douglas Harlan, mocked him with a smirk, the entire room expected collapse. But they didn't know the collapse would be theirs. What happened next wasn't just a twist, it was a reckoning. This is a fictional story, but the outrage, the hope, the truth it stirs, that's real. And sometimes in fiction, we find the courage to ask, what would we do if this were true? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. They said he would come with noise. They expected protests, angry crowds, chants in a language they couldn't understand. A sea of flags waving in defense of a man half the Western world had already decided was guilty. They were ready for defiance. They were ready for fury. What they got was silence. The first glimpse of him came not through a grand entrance, but in the corner of a wide-angle news camera, almost missed behind a reporter's over-rehearsed stand-up. There, moving through a steel-gray doorway, was a tall, slender man in a plain charcoal suit. No lapel pin, no entourage, no speech in hand. Just one object that stood out against the monotone: a red folder tucked neatly under his arm. That was Ibrahim Traoré. The moment he stepped into the federal courthouse, a strange shift rippled through the air. Not loud, not sudden, but felt. The crowd outside had grown bloated with media crews, security lines, hired protesters holding factory-printed signs, and curious onlookers who didn't even know the man's name, only that he was some African leader facing American justice. One man held a sign upside down. Another was eating a turkey sandwich while chanting, "Order in the court," unsure what he was ordering. CNN was live. Fox was late. UBN had already prepared 2 separate headlines just in case. Above it all, the buzz wasn't about the case. It was about the optics. And yet none of that touched him. No one called out his name. No aides guided him. No flags were draped behind him. And when he walked past the cameras, not a single flashbulb went off. "He came alone?" someone whispered, as if confused or disappointed. "No lawyers? No PR team?" "He's already lost," said another voice, tinged with smugness. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't look like a man who'd lost. He looked like a man who didn't need the crowd to win. He walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but deliberation, his shoes echoing on marble too clean for justice and too polished for truth. Every movement was precise. His grip on the red folder wasn't tight, but firm, not protective, not desperate, just intentional. Inside, the courtroom itself felt less like a chamber of law and more like a luxury hotel lobby disguised as democracy. Bottled water lined the judge's bench. Velvet ropes divided the press by tier. A subtle lavender diffuser pumped fragrance into the air to mask the artificial coldness of what was about to unfold. The reporters didn't look up when he entered, not right away. Their eyes were on their monitors, tweeting, prepping opening lines like, "In a dramatic turn today," even though the drama hadn't happened yet. But then came the pause, an inexplicable pause, like a hitch in a well-oiled machine. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from noise stopping, but from something unexplainable entering the room. One by one, heads turned. Laptops stopped clacking. Even the camera operators, trained not to flinch, instinctively zoomed in. He made no gesture, spoke no words, didn't even nod. He just walked to the defense table, alone, without legal counsel, without even a translator. And then he sat down, quietly placing the red folder on the oak wood desk in front of him. The click of it touching the surface was the loudest sound in the room. Not because it was loud, but because it meant something. No one knew what was in that folder, but for reasons none could explain, their spines straightened. Their hands trembled just slightly over keyboards. A young clerk near the front bit his lip. The judge hadn't entered yet, but already the performance was starting to crumble. It was as if everyone in the room had unknowingly rehearsed a play, and now someone had walked on stage with the wrong script. A local journalist scribbled 3 words in her notepad. He knows something. Outside the courthouse, the media kept yelling about international order and criminal negligence. Inside, no one said a word. They were waiting, not for the judge, not for the prosecution. They were waiting to see if the man with no lawyers, no applause, and only a red folder had come to lose or to reveal something none of them were ready for. And in that moment, even before the trial began, one thing became clear. This was no longer a courtroom. It was a test of what truth could do when it walked in with no microphone, but the whole world watching. In a private chamber behind the courtroom, hidden not by a curtain, but by polished mahogany and locked glass, Douglas Harlan stood alone, facing a full-length mirror. He adjusted the folds of his robe with the precision of a performer checking his costume before the opening act. The lighting in the room was harsh by design. White, fluorescent, clinical. It exposed every wrinkle, every angle. Harlan didn't mind. He liked being seen. In fact, he had built a career around it. To the public, he was a federal judge. To his followers, he was justice in motion. That was the tagline on his social media banners. On Instagram, his clips regularly pulled in tens of thousands of views. Slow-motion gavel strikes, courtroom outbursts, perfectly timed eye rolls at public defenders. One video where he declared, "Order is not a request, it's a command," had gone viral after being remixed with dramatic orchestral music. He'd been invited to a late-night talk show because of it, not for his rulings, for his delivery. Harlan fixed his jawline, tilted his head slightly, practiced a scowl, then a look of righteous disappointment. He rehearsed each expression like a monologue. The mirror didn't lie, and that was why he stared into it with such devotion. Because out there in the courtroom, lies had to be worn with conviction. A soft knock at the chamber door. His assistant, a wiry man with clipboards for arms and caffeine for blood, poked his head in. "Press row is full. UBN, Western Daily, even Al Jazeera. They're all here. Standing room only." Harlan smirked. "Good." The assistant hesitated, then added, "One note, though. He came alone." Harlan didn't turn around. "No legal counsel?" "None." "Perfect," the judge said, smoothing a wrinkle in his sleeve. "This won't take long." He reached over to the desk, where a small brass-handled gavel sat polished on a velvet cloth. He lifted it, weighed it in his palm like a weapon. Then he set it down just slightly off-center, angled perfectly for the cameras. "Make sure the courtroom lights hit the right side of the bench. I don't want the shadows to dull the tone." "Yes, sir." "And tell security, no interruptions, no last-minute objections. Today's verdict isn't legal, it's visual." The assistant blinked. "Excuse me?" Harlan turned, finally meeting his eyes. His voice was low but clipped with authority. "This isn't about justice, it's about dominance." The words hung heavy in the air. The assistant nodded slowly, as if unsure whether to agree or run. Harlan had that effect on people. Charisma so sharp it could cut you before you noticed you were bleeding. He walked to the side cabinet, where a framed newspaper hung from his first year as a federal appointee. Youngest judge appointed to high-profile circuit. He never read the article. He just liked the way the headline looked. Headlines were everything. Returning to the mirror, he fixed the hem of his robe and muttered to himself, "A man who shows weakness before cameras loses more than control. He loses narrative." That was what this hearing was about. Not the documents, not the law, certainly not Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't care what the president of Burkina Faso had done or hadn't done. The man had spoken out against Western mining interests. He had said the quiet parts out loud. That was his crime. Not fraud, not corruption, but defiance. In English, in French, in any language that unsettled boardrooms in Zurich and Houston. And today, Harlan would make sure that defiance was punished. Live, on every screen, framed perfectly between the pillars of Western law and the illusion of order. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a pre-drafted statement labeled Emergency Courtroom Response, Tier 1. It began. In the interest of national security and global justice, this court must not tolerate foreign manipulation masquerading as truth. It was a line designed not for law journals, but for sound bites. He didn't need facts. He had frames. Another knock, louder this time. "Showtime," the bailiff called from behind the door. Harlan took one last look in the mirror. Smiled, not warmly, but with the cold confidence of a man who believed he owned the room he was about to enter. Then he turned, lifted the robe at the shoulders, and walked out, not like a judge entering a courtroom, but like a lead actor stepping into his spotlight. What he didn't know, what the cameras hadn't captured yet, was that someone else had already rewritten the ending. And that red folder sitting quietly on the defense table? It wasn't a prop. It was a detonator. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone at the defense table, his posture upright, his face unreadable. The red folder lay in front of him, unopened, its color stark against the dull polished wood. His hands rested gently on either side of it, not clenched, not folded, just still, as if he were holding vigil over something fragile, or powerful, or both. There was no lawyer seated beside him, no interpreter, no aide to lean in and whisper guidance, just the sound of shifting papers, the low murmurs of journalists behind glass, and the barely perceptible hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from calm, but from anticipation coiled so tightly it could snap at any second. Then the doors opened. Douglas Harlan entered like a man stepping onto a familiar stage, his black robe billowing behind him just slightly, enough to create motion, but not mess. Every movement had been practiced. The courtroom assistant discreetly fluffed the seat cushion on his bench before he sat. The brass gavel glinted perfectly under the ceiling-mounted LED panel, which had been adjusted hours earlier for dramatic clarity. He didn't look at Traoré right away. Instead, he let the moment stretch, soaking in the camera angles, the seated press, the optics. Then after a beat, he leaned forward on his elbows and narrowed his eyes toward the defense table, like a lion considering a prey that hadn't shown the proper fear. "So," he said, dragging out the syllable like a note in a song he knew well. "Mr. President," he said the word with a smirk, as if it were a punchline. "This isn't Africa. You don't command anything here." There were a few soft chuckles in the gallery, not loud, not spontaneous, the kind of laughter that happens when people aren't amused, but recognize that power has given them permission to laugh. Harlan raised his eyebrows as if daring Traoré to respond, to raise his voice, to make a mistake. Then louder for the cameras this time, he added, "If you so much as raise your tone, I'll have you dragged out in chains, just like the rest of your people." The words were heavy, colonial, surgical. And yet Traoré didn't blink. He didn't flinch, didn't scoff, didn't look at the gallery or the cameras or the judge's robe, stitched perfectly for intimidation. He simply rose from his chair, not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately, and picked up the red folder. With the poise of someone laying down an offering or a verdict, he stepped toward the bench and placed it carefully, almost gently, on the raised ledge between them. The folder made a soft sound, a click, a thud, a declaration. The entire room seemed to lean in. Traoré met Harlan's eyes and for the first time that morning, spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. "Your robe may be clean," he said, "but your hands are not." And in that instant, something shifted, not in volume, not in motion, but in authority. Long before Ibrahim Traoré stepped into that courtroom, long before the red folder landed like a quiet grenade on the judge's bench, the story had already been written, not by facts, not by the law, but by a team of political consultants, press liaisons, and editors who understood that in the age of optics, perception wasn't just powerful, it was policy. At Western Daily, the city's leading newspaper, 2 different headlines had been drafted a week before the trial. One read, "Traoré crumbles under pressure, a lesson in American order." The other, slightly more dramatic, declared, "From coup to collapse, Judge Harlan restores control." Both were loaded, curated not for accuracy but for momentum. One headline was marked primary release, the other backup if needed. Editors didn't expect to use the backup. Inside UBN's news headquarters, the control booth buzzed with pre-production chatter. A segment called Justice in Action had been cut, polished, and slotted into the 1 p.m. broadcast, well before the hearing even started. The footage included drone shots of the courthouse, slow-motion zooms on the American flag flapping against a blue sky, and a bold voiceover that proclaimed, "When justice is tested, it speaks in one voice, the gavel." The narration was recorded by a retired anchor with a deep, cinematic voice, chosen less for credibility and more for gravitas. None of the producers thought twice. This wasn't unusual. Courts, especially high-profile ones, had long been treated as prepackaged drama. Editors weren't looking for truth. They were looking for closure. Something clean, something digestible, a story where one man falls and another restores order. A victory shot, a villain, a hero in robes. What they didn't expect was that the villain would come in silence, and the hero would start to sweat. Every major outlet had coordinated language in advance. Keywords like volatile, unpredictable, foreign disruption were embedded into press briefings and op-eds. Judge Harlan's bio had been quietly circulated to networks with flattering descriptors. Steadfast, unshakable, pillar of institutional strength. None of it was illegal. All of it was intentional. Even the courtroom's social media team, yes, the courtroom had a social media team, had scheduled a tweet for 12:45 p.m. sharp. Justice speaks loudest in silence, #Harlan delivers. It was supposed to drop moments after Harlan's predicted reprimand of Traoré. The tweet was still in queue, even as the judge began to lose control of the room. Meanwhile, PR firms behind the scenes had provided talking points to commentators in case things veered off script. One memo read, "If defendant speaks out of turn, emphasize cultural misunderstanding. If tensions rise, pivot to upholding courtroom integrity. Under no circumstances validate documentation introduced by the defense unless verified by court administration." The assumption was simple. The truth would either be pre-approved or it would be silenced. The public, of course, never saw any of this. They saw a podium, a flag, a robe, a raised voice. They saw what they were supposed to see. But inside the building, in the back rooms of power, everyone knew this wasn't a trial. It was a show. Harlan had even rehearsed his opening lines in private chambers. He had options depending on Traoré's tone. One began with, "Let this courtroom be a reminder that law transcends borders." Another, more dramatic, went, "Defiance may play well in failed states, but not in federal courts." His assistant had suggested toning that one down. Harlan kept it anyway. They thought they had control of the lights, of the cameras, of the language. But what they didn't control, what no one had planned for, was the man who came with no team, no script, and no fear of silence. And now, with the folder resting in plain view, and the room straining under the weight of its own assumptions, the story everyone thought they were watching was already beginning to change. It no longer belonged to the media or the judge. It belonged to whatever was about to come out of that folder. The folder wasn't flashy. It didn't glow. It didn't hum like a weapon or crackle like a threat. It just lay there, matte red, unassuming, the kind of office supply no one looks at twice. But in that courtroom, in that moment, it pulled the air taut like a string on a bow. Traoré didn't make a show of it. He didn't clear his throat, didn't glance at the cameras, didn't ask permission. He simply opened the folder. His fingertips moved slowly, carefully, lifting the cover with a calm that bordered on ceremonial. The first page was crisp, cream white, no theatrics, no bold letters or underlines or yellow highlighter. Just a simple transaction sheet printed in clean black ink. Bank code, date, routing number, destination. Row 1, a wire transfer of $2.5 million. Origin, Ormcore International Holdings, a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Recipient, Thorne Family Holdings, LLC, a quiet little firm tied to real estate investments and trust management. But one line below that, under authorized beneficiary, was the name that landed like a gunshot inside the judge's own skull. Lucas Thorne, Harlan's son-in-law. The courtroom didn't gasp. No one screamed. It was quieter than that, far quieter. It was the kind of silence that comes not from disbelief, but from understanding. Too fast, too suddenly. A journalist in the second row lowered her pen slowly, almost reverently, like she was afraid even the motion might be interpreted as noise. A court clerk shifted in his seat, eyes locked on the paper, but body frozen in place. Even the stenographer paused for a beat before resuming her rhythmic tapping. Soft, tentative, like she wasn't sure if this was still part of the script. Traoré didn't look up. He simply turned to the next page. A notarized agreement, signed in Zurich, confirming a consulting fee of exactly $2.5 million in exchange for regulatory support and strategic facilitation of international project licenses. The date matched. The companies matched. And the consulting fee wasn't abstract. It was tied directly to a land use decision from Judge Harlan's court 6 months ago, one that had overruled an environmental freeze on a contested mining site in Mali. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. The documents did the talking. Page after page, he continued. Each one building, not in drama, but in weight. Wire confirmations, internal emails, legal correspondence. Every piece was organized, paginated, cross-referenced, the kind of evidence that didn't scream or accuse. It proved, and it proved deliberately. At last, Harlan stirred. He had watched the first few pages with a face of forced detachment, the kind of expression a man wears when the fire is still far away, and he thinks maybe, just maybe, it won't reach him. But now his hand twitched. His fingers clenched around the base of his gavel. A sheen of sweat was starting to form on his forehead, subtle but visible under the courtroom lights. He leaned forward, tried to chuckle, but it came out tight and brittle. "Fake documents," he said, waving one hand vaguely toward the bench. "Foreign disinformation. This court won't be hijacked by fabricated nonsense." His voice didn't carry the same authority as before. It cracked on disinformation. Not enough to be dramatic, but just enough to sound unsure. And in that single crack, something began to split. Not in the courtroom, but in him. One of the younger interns near the gallery leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's scared." Not loud, just enough for a nearby mic to catch it. Traoré didn't respond. He turned another page, and the truth kept stacking, quietly, ruthlessly. The silence that filled the room wasn't emptiness. It was gravity. Jonah Bell had been working in that courtroom for nearly 3 years, and in all that time, he had never once raised his voice. He was the kind of man who blended into the wood paneling, polite, efficient, invisible. His job was to move paper, stamp documents, keep the machine humming without asking what it was grinding. But today, something wasn't humming. Something was off. When Ibrahim Traoré began laying the documents on the judge's bench, Jonah's eyes were drawn to the second page, not because of the numbers, not even because of the names, but because of the watermark. A small, nearly translucent emblem in the lower right corner, a stylized triangle inside a square. He had seen that symbol before. Weeks ago, late at night, Jonah had stayed past his shift to help process a backlog of archived exhibits. One file had come in sealed, flagged internal only, Tier 3, which usually meant high-level review, strictly off limits to clerks like him. But the system had glitched, just briefly, and for less than a minute, the contents had appeared on screen. Enough time for Jonah to glimpse the same emblem, the same payment structure, the same names. At the time, he told himself it was a mistake, a mislabeled exhibit, a ghost record, the kind of bureaucratic artifact that slipped through from another case. He filed it away, closed the tab, told no one. And now, it was sitting on the bench, not hidden, not encrypted, not restricted, exposed. Judge Harlan's voice broke through the silence like a lash. "Mr. Bell," he barked, leaning over the bench, eyes narrow and sharp. "You'll verify those documents, now. Get the chain of custody, confirm the sources, and flag them as inadmissible unless they pass federal standards." Jonah froze. The whole room turned toward him. Just a clerk, no robe, no title, just a man holding the weight of a lie in one hand and the chance to fracture it in the other. He looked at the folder, then at the judge. And then he said, quietly but clearly, "I won't lie." A pause, not dramatic, not shouted, but final. Harlan straightened, his mouth tight. "Excuse me?" Jonah didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He simply took one step back, small but unmistakable, a gesture that wouldn't make headlines, but would make history. The air in the room changed, not because a verdict had been issued, but because someone inside the system had refused to keep pretending. The second hand on the courthouse clock seemed to halt as Ibrahim Traoré eased another sheet from the red folder and laid it, face up, on the bench. Unlike the tidy transaction slip that had stunned the room a moment earlier, this page was messy, threaded with forwarded headers and timestamps, a digital paper trail printed in black and white. Near the top, in a bold sans serif font, an internal subject line jumped off the page. "Gatekeeper confirms, pushback plan approved." Under it, a short exchange of 3 emails. First message, timestamp 2 a.m. GMT, 6 months prior, read, "We'll need Doug to fast-track the ruling if local NGOs file complaints. C-Suite doesn't want Molly tied up until Q4. Confirm if the gatekeeper is still on board." Second message, 15 minutes later, came from an Orem Corps legal strategist. "Gatekeeper locked. He'll kill it in court if we get heat. Final invoice to Thorne Family Holdings by Friday." The third shortest line, Harlan's personal address replying at 2:29 a.m., said only, "Understood." Forward schedule. The judge's email signature, Honorable Douglas L. Harlan, United States District Court, hadn't even been scrubbed. A hollow thud echoed as a reporter's pen slipped from her fingers and struck the floor. Nobody stooped to pick it up. All eyes were on the bench, or on Harlan, whose cheeks were losing color beneath the courtroom lights. Traoré lifted the next exhibit, a 12-page expedited land release agreement. The legal English was dense, but one clause had been underlined in red. Environmental waivers may be issued retroactively at the presiding judge's discretion. The signatures at the bottom were immaculate. Orem Corps' Vice President of Global Extraction, a regional minister in Bamako. And finally, one familiar flourish, Douglas L. Harlan, dated 2 weeks after the midnight email chain. An audible breath rippled through the gallery, as if 50 people had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Harlan tried to speak, but the only sound he produced was an uneven clearing of his throat. Traoré turned another page. This time the courtroom screens flickered on. Jonah Bell had quietly routed the document camera to the monitors, so even the back row could see. A high-resolution satellite photograph filled the displays, a swath of forest in southern Mali, taken 18 months earlier. Lush canopies, deep emerald, stretching to a horizon of blue haze. Directly beside it, the after image appeared. Same coordinates, but now a vast gray wound. Tree stumps like matchsticks, a gash of open-pit earth spiraling downward. And in the lower quadrant, a winding river turned the color of rust. In one corner, a yellow rectangle highlighted a cluster of pale rooftops. Kalea Primary School, distance 1.2 kilometers, with a red hazard icon stamped over it. No one in the room moved. The silence was granular, heavy, filled with a strange static. The knowledge that this was no longer a legal skirmish, but a human calamity made operational by a signature. Traoré did not lift his eyes. He simply placed a transparent evidence sleeve on top of the photos. Inside were 3 printed medical reports, pediatric respiratory cases, skin lesion clusters, a spike in miscarriages. Each report filed by a provincial clinic and each stamped, "Investigation dismissed, insufficient jurisdiction." At the bottom of every dismissal order was a single notation in confident blue ink. D.L. Harlan. A bead of sweat ran from the judge's hairline, tracing the edge of his right eyebrow before hanging precariously at the tip. He reached for his gavel, not to strike order, but as if the familiar weight might anchor him to reality. The handle slipped against his damp palm. Harlan attempted composure, voice tight. "These exhibits are unverified, sourced from hostile interests." But Jonah Bell had already stepped forward, holding a stamped registry log. "Your Honor," he said, steady but shaking, "these files match entries flagged as sealed archival in our own system. Page numbers, checksum code, everything. The judge's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words emerged. Traoré placed the final sheet for this round, a simple cover memo from Oromcore's London office. 4 words, all caps, centered in the middle of the page. Gatekeeper remains our asset. There was no amount, no signature, just certainty. No gavel strike could erase it. No practiced glare could unsee it. The evidence lay exposed, and the title they had once whispered in private, Gatekeeper, now echoed like a verdict in marble halls. The courtroom, which moments earlier belonged to Douglas Harlan's performance, suddenly felt like it belonged to the pages themselves, and each page was a blade, cutting through the script that had been rehearsed so carefully off stage. Judge Douglas Harlan reached for the printed statement resting neatly atop his bench. His pre-written ruling, structured carefully with legal justifications, sound bites, and subtle rhetorical flourishes meant to land well on cable news. His fingers found the edge of the page but didn't turn it. His eyes, once razor-sharp and sure, didn't move to the text. They were fixed elsewhere, locked onto the red folder now lying fully open. Its contents spread like a slow-motion explosion across the courtroom. He tried again, voice low and clipped. As this court resumes proceedings, we remind all parties that foreign-sourced materials must adhere to federal admissibility guidelines under. His sentence drifted midair, incomplete. A pause, a blink. The air in the room had shifted, not from temperature, but texture. It was thicker now, dense with knowing. The kind of silence that isn't passive but conscious, as if every person in that courtroom understood at the same time that they weren't watching justice unfold. They were watching power erode. Harlan cleared his throat, twice rapid, then adjusted his chair as if the discomfort he felt could be chalked up to posture. It wasn't posture, it was panic. He looked down again at the documents, the satellite photos, the bank wires, the contract inked with his own hand. And for a flickering second, he wasn't a judge in a federal court. He was just a man in a suit, reading evidence of his own undoing. One of the courtroom cameras zoomed in automatically, the lens stabilizing on his face with digital precision. Harlan had chosen those angles, had approved the lighting. He had insisted that the left side of the bench be lit slightly warmer than the right, to emphasize his features, to create shadow and structure. But now those same lights caught the glint of sweat gathering at his temples. The camera did not blink. The gavel, always perfectly centered on the bench, had shifted slightly when he grabbed it earlier. It now sat askew, no longer a symbol of order, but a reminder that even props fall out of place when the actor forgets his lines. He reached for his statement again, found his voice. Under Section 38, foreign exhibits must first undergo a procedural verification process. It was barely a whisper masquerading as authority. The rhythm was gone, the resonance broken. His mouth was moving, but the words came out like a man reading instructions in a language he no longer understood. In the second row, a courtroom observer, a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, leaned toward her daughter and said under her breath, "He's not in control anymore." The daughter didn't reply. She was too busy staring, not at Traoré, not at the folder, but at the judge who was unraveling one heartbeat at a time. Harlan tried to turn the page. His hand hesitated, shook. He looked across the room, scanning for someone, anyone to anchor him. The bailiff stood motionless. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, unsure whether to keep recording or pause in mercy. The journalist didn't move. Even Jonah Bell, the quiet clerk he'd barked orders at for years, was now watching him with something close to pity. No one was coming to help, not because they had turned against him, but because they couldn't unsee what they had seen. The illusion was gone. The robe still hung on his shoulders, but the authority that once filled it had seeped out between the seams. Harlan adjusted his tie. It felt tighter than usual. His collar prickled with heat. He tried again, louder this time. "This court will not—" A flicker in his voice, an upward lilt where there should have been steel. He heard it too late. A mic captured it. So did the cameras. And in rooms across the country, newsrooms, offices, living rooms, The viewers leaning in didn't see the confident judge from their morning headlines. They saw something far more human, far more damning. They saw a man cracking open, not with a bang, not with a confession, but with a slow, exquisite collapse that only the guilty recognize when it begins. And somewhere, amid the stillness, the cameras kept rolling. The bailiff moved with the kind of practiced discretion that normally goes unnoticed. One measured step after another, heels muffled by the thick courtroom carpet. His badge caught a shard of light, a brief glimmer that passed across the gallery like a warning bell no one wanted to ring. Judge Harlan was still clutching his script, cheeks blotched, eyes flinching between the cameras and the damning pages on the bench. He didn't notice the bailiff until the uniformed man stopped less than a foot from the dais, close enough for a quiet word, but far enough to keep distance in case the illusion of authority shattered into something less predictable. The bailiff inclined his head, voice low yet steady, each syllable clearing the room of its last traces of rehearsal. "Your Honor," he said, almost respectful, almost regretful, "you are requested for questioning by the Inspector General's office." There was no bang of the gavel, no dramatic objection, no thundering retort. Instead, a thick pause swallowed every breath in the chamber. Harlan's brow lifted in slow disbelief. Questioning? Judges summon, they are not summoned. His lips parted, but whatever response he searched for in legal memory, case law, courtroom protocol, the weight of precedent evaporated before it reached his tongue. The only sound was the faint hum of ceiling lights and the whir of a camera refocusing on his face, eager to capture the instant he realized the script he'd mastered no longer belonged to him. His gaze flicked across the benches, first to the press row, where journalists sat frozen, pens poised in midair, then to Jonah Bell, whose eyes did not waver, finally to the defense table. Traoré was seated again, back straight, hands resting on either side of the red folder, its contents now exposed like an open wound across the bench. He did not gesture, did not smirk, did not so much as exhale loudly. The quiet of his presence felt heavier than any accusation. Harlan's throat bobbed once. He searched for an ally, a lifeline, even a sympathetic nod. None came. The courtroom spectators weren't hostile. They were inert, as though a spell had been broken, and they were unsure whether to applaud or avert their eyes. The bailiff remained motionless, still offering Harlan the smallest shred of dignity, the chance to walk out under his own power. Finally, the judge stood. The robe that had once seemed to flow behind him like a royal cloak now hung limp and awkward, revealing a damp collar and trembling hands. He set the unused gavel down with care, an object suddenly fragile and absurd, and descended the 2 steps from the bench. No one touched him. No handcuffs, no arm on his elbow. It wasn't necessary. Power, when it departs, often leaves a man lighter than air. As he passed the defense table, he couldn't bring himself to meet Traoré's eyes. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps it was fear that he might see something there he could not bear. Pity. Harlan kept his gaze fixed on the courtroom door, every stride smaller than the last, like an actor who realizes the lights are fading before his final monologue. The bailiff followed a half-step behind, neither rushing nor delaying, honoring the silent choreography of downfall. The doors closed with a muted click. A soft exhale spread through the gallery, the release of an audience who had witnessed an ending no playwright could have sold as believable. Cameras remained trained on the vacant bench, as though expecting a ghost to reappear and reclaim the robe. At the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré lowered his eyes to the red folder, its pages still fluttering faintly in the conditioned air, and placed one hand atop it, steady, calm, almost reverent. The courtroom lights seemed to dim around him, or perhaps it was simply that every lens, every stare, every expectation had turned toward the only constant left in the room. A man who had spoken fewer than 100 words and, with those words, dismantled a kingdom built on performance. 6 months earlier. The rain outside hadn't quite started, but the clouds over Nairobi hung low and heavy, smeared across the windows of the hotel like bruises on glass. Inside the penthouse suite of the Mahari Grand, it was all silk, silence, and the soft murmur of engineered hospitality. The kind of hotel where the water in the vase is changed before the flowers need it, where the air is filtered, fragranced, and filtered again, where history never happens, only transactions. Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the room without ceremony. No bodyguards, no aides. Just the quiet stillness of a man who had nothing to prove and no interest in pretending otherwise. He wore a charcoal gray suit, clean but unremarkable, and a shirt that had been pressed by hand that morning by someone who still believed in doing things the right way. The room greeted him not with words but with a rhythm, the ticking of a designer clock, the low hum of an air conditioning vent, the faint clink of ice melting in untouched crystal glasses. Three men were already seated at the far end of the room, backs to the window, silhouettes outlined by the gray light behind them. Their smiles were warm, their ties expensive, their shoes cost more than most villages' annual budgets. They did not rise to greet him. One simply gestured toward the empty leather chair across from them, as if it were a private club and Traoré had finally been granted access. "President Traoré," said the one in the middle, voice smooth as polished granite, "thank you for joining us. It's truly an honor." "I don't recall accepting an invitation," Traoré replied, lowering himself slowly into the chair. The man on the left chuckled. "Well," he said, "sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that aren't officially on the schedule." Their names weren't important. They didn't offer them anyway. No business cards, no affiliations. Just a handshake that lingered half a second too long and a scent of cologne strong enough to overwrite memory. But the briefcase, that was unmistakable. Polished, silver, fingerprint locked. One of the men reached down and opened it with a soft click, like a confession whispered in velvet. Inside, crisp documents, wire instructions, offshore account routing numbers, and a figure printed in large font at the top of a folded page. $50 million. No taxes, no trails, no questions. "For your nation's stability," the man in the center said, his eyes never leaving Traoré's, "and your family's comfort." It was spoken with practiced ease. No pressure in the voice, no overt coercion, just confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing this works, that it always works. They didn't want his removal, quite the opposite. They wanted his silence. "You'll stay in power," the third man said, running a thumb across his gold cufflink. "We'll help with that. Media management, legal buffer, stability metrics. All we ask is discretion. Let the courts manage the resource claims. Stop making noise about sovereignty. The investment narrative is sensitive." The briefcase remained open, gleaming. It wasn't a bribe, not in the old-fashioned sense. It was a purchase, not of his policies, not of his party. It was a purchase of his restraint. They didn't want a villain or a martyr. They wanted a partner, a quiet one. A partner who would smile at summits, cut ribbons at foreign-funded construction sites, and never mention the land, the rivers, the families displaced in the name of development. The pitch was polished, global, familiar. "You'll be called visionary," one man said with a practiced grin. "Your name will be on every investment report. You could even join the World Economic Forum. Maybe even a Nobel nod. Those are negotiable." But Traoré said nothing. He didn't lean forward, didn't glance at the documents. He just stared, long and quiet, as if memorizing not their faces, but their intent. And then after a silence that stretched like tension wire, he stood, closed the briefcase without touching the contents, and said in French, low and even, "I was not raised to sell what I did not build." They didn't understand. Not really. One of them laughed as if it were a proverb. Another nodded like it was a polite refusal that would turn into acceptance later. But Traoré didn't wait to clarify. He walked out without a second glance, and the briefcase remained on the table, glittering, untouched, and suddenly heavy. Traoré didn't say a word for the first 15 minutes. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at the briefcase. While the men from Ormcore took turns polishing their pitch, each sentence dressed in diplomacy and drenched in condescension, he simply listened. His stillness was unsettling, the kind that made the most expensive suits in the world feel suddenly too tight. They offered flowcharts, growth models, public-private partnership plans, every term carefully engineered to sound ethical, inevitable, and above all, beneficial. Their language was global, antiseptic. They spoke of opportunity like missionaries selling salvation, but behind every promise was a subtraction. Fewer trees, fewer farmers, fewer questions. They weren't asking for war. They were offering peace, but peace on their terms. All we need is a little patience, one man said. You don't have to sign anything today. We know the pressure you're under, another added, his voice thick with false empathy. This will solve a lot of that. He gestured casually to the open briefcase, its contents gleaming like the inside of a chapel for capital. Wire instructions, shell companies, trust funds disguised as development portfolios. Traoré didn't even glance. Instead, he reached for a glass of water, took a slow sip, and then gently placed it back on the coaster. The room fell quiet. Then, with a quiet finality, Traoré pushed the silver briefcase shut. The soft, metallic click echoed louder than a door slam. He did it carefully, almost reverently, as if closing the lid on something too vulgar to leave open. He looked at each man, one by one. His eyes held no anger, only certainty. The kind of certainty that can't be bought or borrowed. The kind shaped by sweat, soil, and memory. Then in French, clear and calm, I was not raised to sell what I did not build. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. One of the men tried to chuckle like it was a quaint proverb. You'll think about it, he said, almost pleading. Everyone does. But Traoré was already standing. He didn't shake hands, didn't offer thanks. He turned and walked out, leaving behind the scent of cologne, the gleam of polished betrayal, and three men who suddenly weren't sure they had understood the meeting at all. They hadn't, because they were used to leaders who bent, who smiled wide and signed faster. They were used to resistance that could be negotiated, softened, absorbed. But Traoré hadn't resisted. He had simply refused. No debate, no bargaining, no performance. Just a quiet, no so complete, it echoed louder than 1,000 yeses. As he exited the hotel and stepped into the Nairobi air, thick, humid, and honest, he felt the weight of what he had just declined settle across his shoulders. It was heavier than the money, heavier than the power it promised, but it was the kind of weight a man could carry upright. Behind him, the men in the penthouse suite poured themselves another drink, muttered about pride, and comforted themselves with one final phrase. He'll come around. But they didn't know him. They hadn't seen what he had seen, the rivers that ran brown, the children with rashes near poison wells, the forest cut open like wounds and left to bleed profit. They didn't know the elders who whispered beneath mango trees, or the graves whose names never made the headlines but held the cost of every deal signed in silence. And they had forgotten one thing. Not every silence is submission. The silence didn't last long. 3 weeks after the meeting in Nairobi, an aid agreement from the Western Economic Development Council, worth $120 million, was postponed for administrative review. A health initiative backed by a major European NGO quietly withdrew. Invitations to international energy summits dried up. Phone calls that used to arrive before sunrise stopped arriving altogether. Then came the headlines. Ibrahim Traoré's authoritarian slide. From hope to hubris, Burkina Faso's president loses Western favor. Resource nationalism threatens regional stability. At first, the stories were subtle. Editorials wrapped in concern, diplomacy tinged with disapproval. But then came the op-eds, the panel discussions, the think tank PDFs. He was called unpredictable, erratic, populist, a lone actor derailing development. Some articles accused him of undermining foreign investor confidence. Others claimed he was under Russian influence, a recycled accusation, thin on evidence but thick with menace. His refusal had become a threat, not because it disrupted global economics, but because it challenged global obedience. And yet, he said nothing. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't tweet rebuttals or issue long-winded statements. He simply continued his work, visiting schools, walking farmland with elders, holding town halls without cameras. One morning, weeks after the media storm had started to swirl, he stood under the shade of a wide mango tree in a dusty village northeast of Ouagadougou. There was no microphone, no script, just a circle of farmers and teachers and the scent of dust, sweat, and late-season fruit. They had heard whispers that he'd turned down foreign money, that people in suits had offered something too big to refuse, that consequences were coming. But what they really wanted to know, what they feared more than sanctions or headlines, was whether he would still choose them. Traoré looked around the circle. Some of the faces were familiar from years ago, when he had traveled through the region as an officer, not a president. Their hands were cracked by sun and soil. Their eyes were tired but watchful. He spoke softly, not to avoid attention, but because that's how real things are said. "They offered to let me stay in power," he began, "if I let them take the land you live on. If I stayed quiet while they poisoned your rivers and dug up the bones of your ancestors. If I pretended not to see." A hush swept through the group. No one moved. "And I said no." He paused. "Let the weight of the truth settle. And if they return, I'll say no again." An old woman leaned forward on her cane, her voice like gravel in memory. "Then you'll walk alone, son. But walk anyway." That was the moment that stayed with him more than any speech, more than any courtroom, more than the red folder itself. Because leadership, he had realized, was not conferred by election or applause. It was given in small, quiet moments like these, beneath trees that had stood longer than any government, before people who had nothing to offer but trust, and everything to lose if it was broken. The world outside labeled him difficult, defiant, even dangerous. But under that mango tree, he wasn't a headline or a theory. He was simply a man who had said no when it mattered, and would keep saying it, even if it cost him everything. The wind shifted. The branches above rustled like an unseen applause. And Ibrahim Traoré stood a little straighter, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a man who remembered what he had been asked to forget. It started with a ping, a single breaking news alert. Federal Judge Douglas Harlan removed from courtroom mid-trial. The line felt like a typo, an AI-generated hallucination. Surely someone had gotten the name switched, but as the feed refreshed, the alerts multiplied. Judicial ethics probe launched against Harlan. Leaked documents show corruption ties to foreign firms. Traoré's folder stuns courtroom. Investigations to follow. At Western Daily's newsroom, a long fluorescent bulb flickered overhead as an editor dropped her printed headline onto the floor. It read in bold, all caps, "Traoré Meltdown, How the African President Imploded on American Soil." The article had been scheduled for 1 p.m. sharp, pre-written, pre-approved, prejudged. One junior assistant, pale with panic, stammered, "It's still queued for auto-publish. Should I cancel?" A producer looked at her screen, saw the live stream replay looping on every major channel, and said what no one in the newsroom wanted to say out loud. "We backed the wrong villain." Someone else muttered under their breath, "Can we reframe it as satire?" The UBN control room wasn't faring any better. Footage that had been edited hours earlier, with dramatic music and a mocking voiceover dissecting Traoré's supposed emotional collapse, was still sitting in the post-production folder. But now the man they had cast as the fool had become something else entirely. One anchor, still in makeup, stared at the silent TV wall. Her voice cracked slightly. "We called him unstable." A segment producer buried his face in both hands. It was all scripted, even the thumbnail. At CNN's global desk, the retraction emails had already been drafted. Legal teams advised against calling the documents unverified. Multiple independent experts had already confirmed authenticity. One reporter whispered, "The folder, it's real." Every page, a high-ranking editor took a deep breath, exhaled, and gave the order. "Pull everything." Quietly, no tweets, just rebuild the story. But it was too late. Screenshots of the original headlines had already gone viral, side by side with the judge being escorted out of the courtroom. Reddit threads were lighting up. Hashtags flipped mid-trend. Influencers who had mocked Traoré hours earlier were now deleting posts, reposting with quiet awe. In New York, a satire blogger posted the old headline with the caption, "Western media when the script flips before the commercial break." By late afternoon, editorial offices across Europe and the US were in damage control mode. Fact-checkers were dispatched retroactively. PR liaisons reached out to African embassies. Talk show producers scrambled to rebook their guest segments, not with experts on African instability, but with ethicists, whistleblowers, and anyone who could answer the question now echoing across every control booth. How did we miss this? But the truth was simple. They hadn't missed it. They ignored it. The evidence hadn't appeared from nowhere. The corporations weren't unknown. The whispers of judicial bias had existed for years. The only thing new was the silence, Traoré's silence, that had made the world stop and listen. And now the noise they once used to drown him out was turning inward, exposing their own machinery. Editorial calendars were shredded, press kits deleted, interns dispatched to scrub cached articles before they could be immortalized by archive bots. Some networks aired a sanitized update, developing, judge faces, scrutiny after heated exchange. But none dared say it plainly. He won. In the end, it wasn't rage that unraveled the system. It wasn't revolution or chaos. It was a man in a courtroom with a red folder and 94 words, turning a spectacle into a reckoning. And now the cameras, once aimed like weapons, were desperately trying to find a new angle. It started as a whisper on X, a blurry screenshot, a shaky clip, a 17-second edit with the caption, "He said less than 100 words," and changed the story. Within an hour, the phrase red folder was trending in 5 languages. By lunchtime, it was on t-shirts in Lagos, graffiti walls in Soweto, Instagram bios in Dakar. In Nairobi, a street artist sketched the moment Traoré laid the folder down. No face, just a hand, mid-motion. The caption below read simply, "Proof doesn't shout." In Johannesburg, a retired journalist, once mocked for being too serious about institutional corruption, posted a tearful reaction. "I've covered political trials for 40 years. I have never seen silence do this much damage to a lie." In Accra, university students paused their lectures to replay the courtroom feed. One girl stood in the middle of a packed hall and said, "I want to carry a red folder one day." Her classmates cheered, not for nationalism, not for vengeance, but for truth. In Washington, the footage was dissected frame by frame. Commentators tried to spin it. Was the judge set up? Are these documents truly legal? But they were drowned by the authenticity of the moment. There were no slogans, no edited highlight reels. Just pages, dates, names, transfers, and a judge who had nothing left to say. TikTok exploded. Not with dances, not with filters, but with breakdowns, reactions, slow pans of Traoré's expression, steady, calm, unyielding. One video stitched together every sentence he had said that day. The final frame read, 94 words, that's all it took. Across African nations, the emotional resonance went deeper. In Burkina Faso, where electricity often failed, but radio signals didn't, farmers listened to the translated transcript played on loop. An elder wept as the reporter read aloud, "Your robe may be clean, but your hands are not." He whispered to no one in particular. "That's what we've wanted to say for years." In Senegal, school teachers paused grammar lessons and asked their students, "Who decides what justice looks like?" A young boy raised his hand and said, "The one with the folder." No one corrected him. In Kenya, a digital animator rendered the entire courtroom scene in motion graphic form, stylized, symbolic, yet hauntingly faithful. The clip opened with silence, then the folder hitting wood, then the pages turning. It ended with the judge's chair empty. The title? When Power Lost Its Voice. Even Western audiences couldn't look away. View counts surged. Influencers who had joked earlier in the week now reposted clips with captions like humbled or speechless. Some tried to pivot, saying they always knew something was off. But the internet remembered. One podcast in Boston titled their emergency episode, "The Moment the Gavel Cracked." A former U.S. federal prosecutor admitted, "I was taught to believe silence in a courtroom means submission. I was wrong. This was the loudest silence I've ever seen." But perhaps the most haunting comment came from a woman in Detroit who stitched Traoré's courtroom footage with archival protest clips from the 1960s. Her caption read, "We used to march. We used to shout. Maybe now, we learned to stand still." The ripple was no longer media, it was memory, collective memory, the kind that doesn't fade with likes or scrolls. That afternoon, a mural appeared on a concrete wall outside a UN annex building in Geneva. Just a silhouette of a man, a table, and a single red folder, painted underneath. The courtroom wasn't the stage, the world was. And across that world, filled with cynicism, fatigue, and distraction, people stopped for a moment, not to cheer, not to debate, but to remember what it felt like to believe that truth, even whispered, can still shake the ground. By the time the judge was escorted out and the red folder lay flat and empty on the table, the courtroom had transformed. Not physically, same walls, same wood, same cameras still blinking red, but spiritually. The room no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a confession booth where no one spoke, yet everyone knew the truth had already been spoken. Reporters didn't shout questions. Lawyers didn't shuffle papers. Even the stenographer stopped typing, hands hovering above her keys as if waiting for permission to record history. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred, and in that stillness it became clear. This had never been a trial about a man. It was never about Ibrahim Traoré's guilt or innocence. Not really. This was about something much older, much deeper, a ritual dressed up as justice, a courtroom that had turned into a performance hall where rulings were crafted for headlines and power wore robes to hide its stains. For years, perhaps decades, it had worked. People played their roles. The system rolled forward like a well-oiled camera dolly, until someone walked in without a script. That someone didn't raise his voice, didn't call for revolution, didn't wave a flag or demand applause. He simply laid down paper with signatures, with bank codes, with satellite images of wounds the world chose to ignore, and watched the room flinch. And when it flinched, it cracked. The stories that had been drafted before the trial now read like satire. Traoré humiliated in U.S. court became a ghost headline, visible only in archived screenshots shared with disbelief. A system so confident in its choreography had been undone not by protest, not by violence, but by evidence it could no longer deny. Outside, the headlines shifted, but inside, something more important happened. Eyes met. A bailiff who had always looked the other way now looked down in shame. A young clerk who once feared losing his job took a step back and gained something no paycheck could buy. A judge who built his fame on spectacle sat frozen, staring not at Traoré, but at himself. That's what shook them. Not the folder, not the silence, but the mirror. Because for the first time, the system was forced to look at its own reflection. Not as a beacon of justice, but as an instrument of convenience, of performance, of power masked as principle. And what it saw wasn't just Harlan's fall. It saw every name redacted from every lawsuit, every protester silenced under the label of foreign interference, every environmental law bent behind closed doors, every ruling fast-tracked not for truth, but for profit. It saw itself, unmasked, unscripted. And when the final camera zoomed out, the only man not surprised by any of it was the one who said the least. Traoré didn't speak again. He didn't claim victory. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't raise a finger when the judge was escorted out. He simply picked up the folder, closed it, and walked away. Because it was never about him. And as the room sat in stunned silence, someone near the gallery whispered, half in awe, half in mourning, "It wasn't a trial, it was a mirror." The cameras stayed, the microphones remained. Satellite vans hummed for days outside the courthouse, waiting for a flash, a statement, a soundbite, anything. But Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. No press conference, no social media post, no carefully worded presidential statement read from behind a marble podium. He walked out of that courtroom as quietly as he had walked in, calm, unreadable, alone. Producers panicked, editors scrambled, political analysts filled airtime with theories, stretching a 94-word silence into hours of speculation. Why isn't he speaking? What's his next move? What does the folder mean for Africa? For the West? But still, no word, not a whisper, not a nod, just stillness. In a world drowning in commentary, Traoré's silence felt louder than any speech. It wasn't avoidance. It was intentional, deliberate, measured like the footsteps of a man who had already said what he needed to say and saw no point in repeating it for applause. And so, the world began to listen to the absence of noise. A single quote, posted anonymously online, began to spread. He never raised his voice, but the world heard him. It appeared under headlines, on protest signs, etched into murals, printed on t-shirts, tweeted in dozens of languages. The quote traveled faster than the story itself because it captured something rare, something so many had forgotten, that dignity doesn't shout, that truth doesn't perform, that strength isn't always loud. In Detroit, a retired civil rights activist printed the quote and taped it above her kitchen sink. In Lagos, a street artist painted it beneath Traoré's silhouette, folder in hand, eyes calm. In Paris, a university professor opened his lecture with it, telling his students, "This is what resistance looks like when it refuses to become rage." And yet, Traoré stayed silent. Offers poured in, talk shows, documentaries, guest lectures, a special UN summit appearance. One European publisher even offered him a seven-figure book deal titled The Red Folder, One Man's Trial for Justice. His office declined them all. He didn't need a book. He had already written one, in evidence, in restraint, in memory. Because in a time where everyone was desperate to be heard, Ibrahim Traoré proved that the world will pause, even if just for a moment, for someone who dares to say nothing. Nothing loud, nothing extra, nothing more than what needed to be said. And somehow that silence kept speaking. 3 days passed, still no speech, no television appearance, not a single word from Ibrahim Traoré. The world, now held in suspense, had nearly grown impatient with his silence, until a story broke. Not from Washington, not from Paris, but from a quiet, independent paper in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. There, on page 3, beneath a grainy photo of Traoré standing under a mango tree, was a scanned piece of notebook paper, yellowed slightly at the edge, the handwriting unmistakably human. At the top, a header in modest print, "Note received by our correspondent, hand-delivered." Authenticated. It was 112 words long. But it was the first 3 lines that stopped readers in their tracks. The kind of words you don't just read, you feel. Power doesn't need to scream when the truth is real. It doesn't need permission to echo, and it never belongs to one man alone. No signature, no seal, just ink and intention. The letter spoke not of victory, but of weight, of responsibility. It made no mention of Judge Harlan, no celebration of justice served. Instead, it spoke of memory, of land, of names carried silently by those who never made it to courtrooms or headlines. It thanked no one. It blamed no one. It simply acknowledged what had happened, and what must never be forgotten. By noon, screenshots of the note had reached 5 continents. In Johannesburg, students posted it outside law school doors. In Atlanta, a reverend read it aloud before his sermon. In Dakar, a grandmother wrote it on the back of a family photo and told her granddaughter, "This is how you hold your ground." There was no press release to confirm it. There didn't need to be. The world recognized the voice, not because it was loud, but because it had once been silent, and still changed everything. Traoré never commented on the letter, but he didn't need to. The world already had what it came for, not a speech, a mirror. And in that mirror, they saw what power could look like when it served truth, not itself. It started quietly, just like the man who had carried it. In a dusty schoolyard in Ouagadougou, a little girl walked into class with a red folder clutched to her chest. It wasn't filled with homework. It wasn't heavy. But the way she held it, tight, careful, proud, made the teacher pause. "Why the folder?" he asked, smiling gently. She looked up, wide-eyed, and said simply, "In case I ever need to tell the truth." That same week across the city, a retired mason spray-painted a mural on a crumbling wall. It showed a pair of hands, not clenched in fists, but calmly placing a red folder on a wooden bench. Above the image, in bold, uneven strokes, the words, "Truth doesn't shout, it remembers." The phrase caught fire. It appeared on protest signs in Nairobi, on cafe chalkboards in Harlem, on the inside covers of textbooks from Johannesburg to Philadelphia. In a small classroom in Ghana, a civics teacher held up a photo of the courtroom, Traoré standing alone, the judge behind the bench, and asked his students a question. Who held the power in this room? There was a pause, then a hand went up. A small boy, no older than 9, answered, "The one with the folder." The class laughed softly, but the teacher didn't. He nodded and whispered, "Exactly." The courtroom doors slid open on their hinges, and Ibrahim Traoré stepped through them exactly as he had entered hours before, steady, unguarded, alone. No bailiffs flanked him, no supporters crowded the hallway. The news crews that had waited for spectacle found only quiet footfalls on polished stone. One reporter, microphone trembling in her grip, blocked his path and begged for a final quote. He paused, met her eyes with a calm that seemed to hush even the humming lights overhead, and spoke just once. "It was never about me." Then he walked on, past cameras, past headlines already rewriting themselves, past a world still struggling to understand how silence could be louder than any gavel. Thousands of miles away, an elderly woman in Detroit peeled yesterday's newspaper from her mirror and taped Traoré's parting words in its place. She read them aloud each morning, a whispered vow to speak only when truth required. At a law school in Johannesburg, a first-year student titled his term paper "The Day Silence Won," and argued that a single act of restraint can dismantle a courtroom built for performance. His professor, long jaded by precedent, found himself reading every page twice, and beneath the shade of a broad mango tree in Burkina Faso, a young girl balanced a scarlet folder on her knees. Inside were blank pages. On the cover, she scribbled a promise of her own. "One day, I'll carry one too." No statues were raised for Ibrahim Traoré. No anthem marked the hour of his quiet victory. The world moved forward, stocks rose and fell, new scandals replaced old ones. Yet something subtle had shifted. In boardrooms, executives hesitated before signing away distant rivers. In newsrooms, copy editors paused over adjectives like unstable and volatile. A thin current of doubt flowed through systems too long certain of themselves. Those who had felt powerless, villagers beside polluted streams, clerks buried beneath sealed archives, students told their voices were too small, carried a steadier light in their chests. They spoke a fraction less loudly, but a measure more firmly, because they had seen a man refuse to trade his silence for applause, and in that refusal they recognized a deeper sound. Truth, when it is real, does not fade. It echoes. And in echoing, it finds new voices, quiet, resolute, unafraid to let silence do the work that shouting never could. Stories about power often lean on spectacle, roaring crowds, fiery speeches, triumphant anthems. What makes the saga of the red folder so arresting is its refusal to shout. Ibrahim Traoré never wielded volume, he wielded stillness. In a world that equates loudness with strength, his silence rearranged the moral landscape, exposing how easily institutions forget their first duty, to serve truth rather than choreograph it. Yet this is not merely a tale of a righteous outsider toppling a corrupt insider. Harlan's fall, though dramatic, is almost secondary. The deeper revelation is systemic, a courtroom calibrated for optics, a media cycle hungry for pre-written narratives, a global economy comfortable exchanging rivers for quarterly gains. The folder became a mirror, and that mirror was big enough to reflect more than one man's wrongdoing. It showed how ordinary clerks, reporters, and bystanders can enable injustice simply by accepting the script placed in their hands. What inspires me most is not Traoré's victory, but his economy of action. 94 words, one gesture, and the courage to endure a manufactured humiliation. Nothing extravagant, everything essential. It suggests that integrity, though quiet, is intensely persuasive, because it rings at a frequency cynicism cannot imitate. When people witness authentic conviction, even the most elaborate performance shakes. The story also reminds us that moral authority is portable. It travels from courtrooms to classrooms, from a grandmother's mirror in Detroit to a mango tree in Burkina Faso. No medals, no monuments, just a slow, steady echo, redefining what power looks like. That ripple effect feels tangible. I find myself wondering how many red folders lie dormant in our own lives. Pieces of evidence, untold stories, principled stands we've postponed because we feared the room wasn't ready. So here's a gentle question for you, the listener. If you were handed a red folder containing a truth everyone else preferred to ignore, would you hold it up, even if no one applauded? Your answer might not change a headline today, but it could start an echo that outlasts any spotlight. This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by real public figures. Ibrahim Traoré, Judge Harlan, and all individuals mentioned are real people whose actions and public personas have shaped contemporary discourse. While the dialogue and settings have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, the emotions, questions, and issues raised reflect genuine societal conversations. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to Captain of Truth. We bring real people, real tensions, and real turning points to life, one story at a time. Subscribe now. Your curiosity fuels the next story.